Your grandma and grandpa can post on Facebook from beyond the grave. Welcome to the sooner than later next level of false reality. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, Josh Milton of Metro had an interesting write-up on this, and here's what's going on. Because if you didn't know, Meta, aka Facebook, Instagram, etc., was just granted a patent back in December that basically is for an AI system that can simulate a user's activity. Now, the patent gives essentially two examples of where this could be useful for Meta or possibly you. Quote, when the user takes a long break or if the user is deceased. So this patent, first reported by Business Insider, says that the AI system is a large language model. The patent also says that basically the training data could be the user's own account. So we're talking posts, comments, likes, chats, even voice messages, maybe videos that have been uploaded to, let's say, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And this allows the model to essentially predict the next word in a sentence, much in the same way that a user did. So this is called natural language processing. So naturally, this would then allow friends and family to hear the voices of the dead or possibly video. And essentially, it's doing this by cloning the person's voice or likeness to simulate audio and video, essentially the same way that deepfake technology works. So Meta first basically filed for this patent in November of 2023, and it expires in 2043. Andrew Bosworth, he is the CTO of Meta, is listed as the primary author of this patent. Now, the company also said that the granted patent doesn't necessarily mean the company will pursue or roll out this technology, and a spokesperson said, and I quote, "We have no plans to move forward with this example." So thanks to Josh Milton for that primer, but quite frankly, I don't believe that. I don't believe that they're not going to pursue this alongside of their own Meta AI evolution. And we've talked about these things before as well. Basically, an AI recreation of the deceased, speaking in court on behalf of the murder victim, all these kinds of things. But this takes it, quite frankly, to another global level. The biggest issue here, basically, that I have is that this is yet another way that we are creating false realities and illusions for ourselves. This has the ability, I think, to do long-term damage to individuals and society in general. And so I want to go through this so basically we understand why this should not come to fruition. And so I think the first real issue here is that we have essentially the disruption of what should be a natural and healthy grieving process. Because I'm going to be focusing on the deceased more than anybody else, right? If you think about it, grief requires finality. Just personally, about 8 years ago or so, my father passed away. That is obviously very difficult. I would love to have another conversation with him, but part of that grieving process is understanding that you've got to let that go, that he or she or your loved one is not coming back. Psychological healing depends on accepting that level of permanence, and AI replicas would interrupt that. And I think it would interrupt it significantly. Interacting with a digital version of, let's say, your deceased loved one is going to reinforce either denial that the person is gone, or it's going to complicate that grief process and extend it. There's also an emotional dependency risk as well. So individuals may start substituting this interaction with this AI for real social support. In other words, turning to your loved ones in your moment of need, in your moment of grief, and instead just spending 24 hours a day talking to the AI version of your loved one is a very real possibility here for a lot of people, especially for those that you're close with. This is about the dichotomy of the human mind. Essentially, the deceased person is both gone and present in a scenario like this, which then has to have a destabilizing effect on essentially what should be an emotional closure that we all need. And if you've lost a loved one, and I've lost a few, it's a tough prospect to think that I could then basically have conversations with them ostensibly from beyond the grave, but it's a facsimile, which really brings me to my next point, which is this is essentially identity distortion. And therefore, I've got a lot of concerns on things like AI autonomy or how this is being controlled. I think, quite frankly, this is simply misrepresentation, right? An AI trained on past data essentially freezes that person in time, right? It cannot properly reflect on growth, regret, moral change, all those kinds of things. Nobody is perfect. My father, for example, wasn't perfect either. And if the AI basically is frozen in time, that is inconsistent with somebody that, let's say, accepts their faults and improves on themselves, like most of us try to do, right? It's a huge issue. So by virtue of that, the other side of this is that Meta controls this. So a company-controlled model essentially then allows them to define how a person speaks after death. Meta's algorithms could literally change a person's views on things that skew reality and perception, not to mention your memory of the person. And how would we possibly know? Maybe I remember that my dad was a Republican and now Meta wants him to be a Democrat, or vice versa, or something along those lines. Or take a position that is favorable to Meta. Hey, son, you should really buy this product. How would we know that they're doing this? How would we know that they're potentially manipulating this? This would create a fragmented identity in our minds. It would distort the reality of what was. And I think that's a huge thing. And so think about it this way. Past posts were not created with the expectation of future simulation. So if my father was posting on Facebook, and he did not have a Facebook account, thank God, basically he wasn't thinking about what that's going to look like from beyond the grave. He was just posting in the moment. And so my next point here is that I feel like this is manipulation. It's potentially emotional exploitation as well. Knowing this horrific company, and you can go back and look at everything I've talked about regarding Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, this would inevitably become a commercialization of some point, especially of the memory of a loved one, right? Emotional attachment then becomes monetizable. It's an engagement that Mark Zuckerberg can profit off of, literally exploiting our grief. And go back and watch my segment or listen to my segment entitled "It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail," and you tell me that he wouldn't do this for profit, right? It's also behavioral influence, right? Simulated loved ones, like I mentioned before, they could potentially nudge your political view or your purchasing habits and all of that. Like, hey, son, I really like buying Apple products or Samsung or whatever. You remember that, don't you? Maybe I don't, but maybe now I think he did. Maybe that influences me. You know what I mean? My dad had a love of cars, for example, that got instilled into me. I remember that. He was a big fan of Mercedes. He always said if he could buy a Mercedes, he knew he would have made it in the United States as an immigrant. That's always been with me. But what if all of a sudden, 20 years from now, the AI version of my father says it wasn't Mercedes, it was actually Audi or BMW or something else? It's going to make me question my reality. And so there is a big problem here because people inherently trust familiar voices. And so AI can exploit that bias in all of us, right? And so the boundary between what is essentially authentic versus synthetic in terms of relationships essentially erodes. It starts to overlap. And that's a huge problem. And I think that has huge social and cultural consequences for all of us. It's the normalization of false relationships. And society may begin to prefer a controllable AI companion over the complexity that is a human, and then the bonds and relationships that we create. We're already seeing the infancy of this outside of this, right? How many in the younger generation are getting AI girlfriends or AI boyfriends, which really does skew expectations of reality? A real human isn't 100% compliant or sycophantic, right? An AI could be, and an AI typically is. And I remember I've had a dating history, as most of us have had a dating history, and my past girlfriends, etc., didn't always agree with me. I didn't always agree with them. They were never like, yes, whatever you want 100% of the time, and I've not liked that either, right? That's the huge issue. And this inevitability then I think leads to like a reduced tolerance for things like imperfection, because nobody's perfect. You can love somebody deeply, but that also doesn't mean you're not going to argue with them on occasion. AI versions can be curated. They can be edited. They can be idealized. Real people cannot. And that's a huge, huge problem with this entire thing. It starts to rewrite core memories, I think. Collective memory can become modifiable. And if you think about it and understand the science behind this, as I've been reading about this, every time you think about an event in your past, whatever that is, you're technically overwriting that memory. That's why if you're remembering like a Simpsons line from 20 years ago, you sometimes get it wrong because you remembered it initially correctly, but as you went back and said it again and again, sometimes these things shift and they skew, right? So that's a big issue. And we're not even talking about the moral confusion here that we would have. Is interacting essentially with your deceased loved one's simulation, is that an actual remembrance? Or is it something inherently different? Is it ethical to take essentially the approximation of your loved one and then use it for your own purposes? Right? I mean, we're already going through this phase in AI where, or this phase in society where AI is being used to essentially undress people, right? I mean, look at the problems that Grok has on Twitter, aka X. It's being investigated by like multiple major countries, the EU, Canada, and a whole bunch of others. This could be, even worse than that. It could be the next step, essentially an unhealthy sexual behavior. If I can take all of the videos and recordings and whatever of like an ex or something, even forget the deceased, and just make it what I want it to be, perfect and compliant and all of those things, it fundamentally changes my memory, but it fundamentally basically allows the other person, the person I'm targeting, the person that I'm making this proximity for, they start to lose agency by virtue of that because my perception of them is now skewed based on what I'm seeing or interacting with this artificial intelligence. And so I think that this is crazy. And think of the psychological effects of this in general on the living population, if we're going back to the deceased. Think about this. Knowing that your posts may train a future replica of yourself, you start to alter your self-expression. You start to adapt to that as opposed to what you would naturally start talking about. We then start performing in our posts, and so would we then be remembered in a different way? Because this is the perception that I want of the world and it's not actually me. And there are a lot of people out there that will stunt on that, like, look at this car, look at this dope watch, look at all of these things. And you can love those things, but you don't make it necessarily part of your character unless you are trying to basically project something that you are not. You can enjoy those things and still be yourself, but a lot of people will take that and say, look at me, I'm rich, I'm this, I'm that, when quite frankly, they're not. That's a big issue. And I think this leads to basically an understanding that then, if this is the case, that we're always under some kind of self-surveillance. We're always watching what we say and do, knowing that we're trying to craft this ultimate narrative for basically us from beyond the grave, right? We could self-censor ourselves due to fear of like a permanent digital reanimation, in that vein. We are a society that gets plastic surgery. We perform for cameras. We do all of these kinds of things. So think about the long-term ramifications of those people that are not comfortable enough with themselves, to basically then perform. Does my perception then change of the person? Do I get a false understanding of who this person is if they're a friend of mine? These are things that I wouldn't want. I'd want to know all of them, warts and all, and that's the huge thing. And so existentially, and this is an existential argument, this I think leads to discomfort. I mean, the idea that your personality can essentially be reconstructed, to me, raises serious questions about authenticity. It really, really does. And I mean, we also in part lose ownership over our own narrative, over who we are, because our identity then becomes a product after we die. And I think that's something that I think shouldn't be. I really shouldn't. And so I then think, there's a risk, right? And the risk in society, I think, is towards the most vulnerable here. Think about children. They're my first thought when I'm thinking about who would be impacted by this the most, right? They have a much greater susceptibility to things like emotional confusion, between AI and real relationships. You can go, look at or listen to any psychologist talking about this relationship. Kids cannot see around corners, right? And so that is of deep concern here. And then there's the elderly, right? Coming from the cybersecurity side, we know that they get scammed. They're vulnerable for these things. And so imagine manipulation through deepfakes or digital personas or, your dead husband or wife coming back from the grave. People with mental health conditions that have loved ones that pass on, right? I mean, think about the potential reinforcement of things like delusions or disassociation or like attachment disorders. These are all things that there's a lot of people that have that, right? And as a historian, I kind of fear that future generations will start inheriting AI representations of their ancestors, and they're not going to get an accurate picture of this. Part of understanding your humanity is understanding where you've been. Not everybody has that luxury or privilege, but if you do, understanding, those past ancestors, I think is an important thing, but also understanding them accurately ensures that your self-narrative, your family narrative, continues on. And finally, I think there are real long-term implications with this. I think that for society, this is just downright dangerous. It's literally a redefinition of death for a lot of people, because a lot of people aren't going to blur that line between talking to AI grandpa versus talking to real grandpa, right? Or whoever your loved one is. The closure that we need in the grief process, it could be replaced with like a perpetual interaction with just essentially a facsimile of what you remember. And so it dilutes reality. I think that's just the best way, as I'm just took basic notes on this, and so I think having an increasing difficulty that distinguishes authentic from algorithmic relationships is of serious concern here, right? This is a huge issue, and we're building a revenue model for Mark Zuckerberg on top of it if we're doing this, and so it's a huge problem. Not to mention the fact that if these AIs start to become homogenous, start pumping these things out, we could potentially lose the understanding of what made our loved one unique, or possibly even ourselves if we're just performing for the camera, for our inevitable death, right? And so I think the bottom line is simply this. Healthy societies on authentic relationships, or rather, healthy societies depend on authentic relationships. They depend on things like moral accountability, something we don't get from Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. And it also requires the finality of death for mental stability. I think that's so unbelievably important. And as much as it sucks to lose a loved one, and Lord knows it does, it's so unbelievably important. And an AI copy of your loved one, it just risks undermining all of this, because it could potentially alter their identity, or at least your perception of their identity. It can distort your memory. It disrupts the natural grieving process. So I am not for this at all. I think that we need to put the brakes on this, as we do with a lot of AI development. But this one has the ability to fundamentally transform society to the negative, to fundamentally transform basically our loved ones into deep fakes and alter us forever. And I think that's a huge, huge issue. This is not about disinformation about one political thing or the other. This is about a loved one that you know and you remember, and fundamentally you won't. And I think that's really at the core of this. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. But please, none of you dead AIs. And also feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.